Nancy, we're talking today in Paris. You've been invited to give a series of lectures at the Sorbonne and the Séminaire Marx. I wanted to start by asking you about Paris and about French political and intellectual life and the role that it's played in your trajectory. Is it been an important influence and pole of gravity, or has Berlin or other kinds of European centres of intellectual and political life been more important for you?
I think that my trajectory, my development involved the meeting of several different strands of thought, of which French thought was one, and especially Foucault. But of course, I came to Foucault and to French post-structuralism more generally after having been through the New Left, where I had, in the US, encountered Western Marxism, so-called the Frankfurt School and so on, and that remains a second important, center of influence. Then there was the strand of American pragmatism of Richard Rorty was very influential on me, and of course feminist theory coming from pretty much everywhere. But I didn't encounter, well, of course I had studied Sartre and so on in graduate school, but it was in graduate school that I first read Foucault. And that made an enormous impression on me, especially The Order of Things, Les Mots et les Choses, and Discipline and Punish. I read them both in English translation as a graduate student. And I felt that this posed an enormous challenge to the kind of Frankfurt School Hegelian Marxism that had been until then my principal, worldview, so to speak. An enormous challenge, and one that it was absolutely necessary. It was not something you could just ignore and brush aside and say this is, not Marxism or something. And so these were my very first publications as I was a young professor. And I was really trying to look at which aspects of Foucault seemed to be very problematic for any attempt to create a new Marxism for our time, and which aspects of Foucault's thought were real enrichments and should absolutely be integrated. So it was kind of sorting the wheat from the chaff kind of project, and it was in connection with that I first started, spending time in France. And the first thing I did here in Paris was to attend this seminar. I'm trying to remember if it was at the École Normale or if it was at the Collège de Philosophie. I'm sort of vague in my mind. But anyway, it was directed by Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe and, comment il s'appelle? I'm not good with names anymore. Jean-Luc Nancy. Yeah. And they were kind of these Heideggerian, Marxian leftists, and it was a spectacular group of people. It included Derrida, it included Sarah Kaufman, who was then alive. Claude Lefort was there from time to time. Who else was there? I don't think Lyotard was there. I don't remember. Anyway, so this was really moved me more into the Derridian sphere. And there I had the same problem, but in for me, a somewhat easier form, because I found this sort of attempt to develop a left Heideggerian radicalism quite problematic. And I wrote an essay, The French Derridians, Politicizing Deconstruction or Deconstructing the Political. And it was more the second, as it seemed to me. So I was finding myself then in these dialogic, somewhat critical, contestatory relationships. But in both cases, I took the thinkers very, very seriously because I think they were great, brilliant thinkers. And I thought it was very important for people coming from the kind of commitments, intellectual political commitments that I had developed in the New Left, to take them very seriously and to engage with them. And that approach developed over the years. Since then, I developed a close dialogue with Luc Boltanski, and French thought. Bourdieu was a very important figure for me as well, Pierre Bourdieu. I knew him a bit at the University of Chicago. I was less in France. I was teaching at Northwestern in Chicago for many years, and he had very close relations with U of C. We had a social theory group with many meetings with him. Those were the most important figures for me, those four. So it became, Paris became an important touchstone. Of course, I love being in the city. And then I developed Michel Viviorca, who was then directing the Collège d'Études Mondiales, proposed that I should take a so-called chair. And that gave me a regularized, perch, an institutional home here. And then I started coming here pretty much every year for about a month, usually in May.
Great.
That's it.
So that's interesting. So that must have been mainly the 80s and the 90s you're talking about.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that was a period when, perhaps an older generation of Anglophone Marxists had fallen out of love with France and Paris.
Yes.
Famously, Perry Anderson proclaimed in the early 80s that Paris had become the intellectual capital of reaction.
Yeah.
And of course, the high tide of Althusserianism and indeed, other forms of Marxism, situationism and Trotskyism and Maoism and other forms had died down. So you kind of were against the flow, in the sense you became interested in French thought at a time when actually French thought was, in many cases, actively anti-Marxist.
Well, I think it's a bit complicated. I have to say that part of what interested me and what troubled me was the American reception of post-structuralism, which was really depoliticized and very esoteric and faddish and annoying. But I felt, nevertheless, that, again, especially Foucault and Derrida, at this point, a little later Bourdieu, were very serious thinkers. And I was not convinced that they had nothing to offer a Marxist, a kind of expanded, not unorthodox Marxism that I was interested in developing. On the other hand, I did recognize and wrote about this, that what was going on in France with a lot of post-structuralism thought was that it was providing a kind of seemingly radical political transition actually away from Marxism. In the case of some people, that did go to the right or some center right position. Derrida to the end claimed still to be a person of the left, and Foucault, we could argue about whether he was criticizing or defending neoliberalism in those last lectures. But there's no question that both in the United States and in France, post-structuralist thought served as an exodus from Marxism. But I was intent on showing that this thought could be, or aspects of this thought was useful for us, and could and should be reframed, integrated, do something with it.
Right.
That we shouldn't leave it to the right.
But that must have been quite a lonely position, because you were in a field which was polarized on the one hand by, as you say, an American version of post-structuralism, which was highly depoliticized and more hostile to Marxism, and
Yes.
shed into then post-Marxism, and so on. And on the other hand, a whole series of Marxist polemics with post-structuralism, postmodernism from, well, not just polemics, but attempts to critically engage in a highly critical form with those forms of thought on the sides of people like Kalinikos, Harvey, Jameson, and others. So having that position at that moment must have been quite a complicated thing to navigate.
Perhaps. I mean, I think I did feel closer to the people you just mentioned on the Marxist side. But you see, in the case of Foucault, I felt that he was very much, I would say, he was anatomizing the sort of the forms of domination associated with the social democratic welfare state at the very moment when the welfare state was being unraveled with the sort of stealth advent of neoliberalization. And I thought this was, as a new leftist, I had that whole same critique of the bureaucratization, clientelization, we were clients and not citizens, right? All of that stuff was very important in the U.S. New Left, at least. SDS famously, participatory democracy, and so on and so forth. So I already had these ideas about these forms of domination that Foucault was theorizing in a work like Discipline and Punish. From a different perspective, Habermas was doing something similar with the colonization of the life world, juridification. The welfare state turns everything into this system form. This was all very congenial to me. I could see that these were two idioms for talking about the same thing. I thought that was important to be talked about. It was, and I didn't think that this in any way refuted any critiques of exploitation or any other aspects of Marxism. I saw this as, a way of thinking about the larger institutional space of what was then social democratic or state-managed capitalism. Of course, it took me a while, it took many people a while to understand that we, and not just Foucault, but we were anatomizing something that was in the process of disappearing. And then, we'd have to, look at neoliberalism as a successor form of capitalism. Was it lonely? I was juggling many things at the same time. I was also trying to become an established philosopher as a Marxist, interested in French and German thought in a world dominated by Anglo-analytic philosophy, including analytic Marxism. And this was a kind of, the moment in which political philosophy was kind of, in its very creative period in the Rawls, Sen, Dworkin, Nozick. These were all great thinkers, but this was not my thing. And I was trying to find a way to follow my agenda. And I mentioned Richard Rorty before. He was so important to me because he blew up analytic philosophy from the inside. That you can't imagine how empowering this was to graduate students and young professors, especially those of us who had re-entered the university from a period in the New Left, and were trying to figure out how to find a voice in this analytically dominated world. Rorty, I feel, helped me find my voice, and of course I loved his critiques of foundationalism, including against Habermas and others. And on that point, he was closer to Foucault, and so was I on that one point, foundationalism or historicism, you could call it. I was fighting that battle, analytic continental, as they called it, liberalism versus Marxism, and then, of course, gender. Then, of course, the rise of feminist philosophy, which I had at least some small hand, along with a very brilliant generation of thinkers in developing in that era. So I was, trying to find a place to be, doing lots of different things at once, including the French, German, and the Anglo-American.
To push a bit further on that, because we're in a kind of strange context, particularly in France, where, for someone like me who witnessed the post-structuralism versus Marxism debates in the Anglophone world in the 80s and the 90s, to be living in France now is a very strange sort of sensation, because post-structuralism and deconstruction has been rediscovered by a section of the French right, indeed by the Macronists as well, a whole section of the Macronists, as a source of all evil, as the origin of le wokisme, as they call it, le gender, all these kind of fake concepts. And it's very odd to be, have French people just rediscovering this in 2023, as if these previous debates have not happened, and it's, French thought that's being in their view at least, re-imported via American thinkers. So what do you make of this whole sequence that now seems very distant, actually, of that big Marxism versus post-structuralism debate? What is the balance sheet of that for you?
Well, I think the balance sheet is basically the rediscovery of Marxism and of capitalism in this huge crisis that we're in. I'm seeing that in France as well. I'm less, familiar with the stuff on the ground here than you are. But even in this visit, I've encountered so many young people who are passionately interested in Marxism, and by contrast, I'm hearing many fewer references to post-structuralist thinkers. So I think there's a new generation radicalizing now. That's certainly true in the US as well, probably in the UK too, I assume. Traveling in the US, giving lectures like in Midwestern universities, I'm meeting young people, literary scholars, anthropologists, who say to me, I was educated in the heyday of post-structuralism, and I have such horrible gaps in knowing the things I need to know to do the work I want to do now. And they're all going back and studying Capital in reading groups. So they are criticizing their own formation during that period. Now, this is obviously very different from the weaponization of this thought by the right wing. That hasn't happened in the US now. The right wing goes on and on about critical race theory and sexuality studies that groom, young people to default from appropriate, healthy forms of identity and sexuality. They're not quite sophisticated enough, I think, to talk about deconstruction or any of that stuff. But let me ask you, how do French intellectuals on the left respond to that? Because they're do they try to defend these thinkers, or do they just as soon say we've moved on, or what?
Well, I think it's complicated. First of all, there's a big generational split.
Sure.
And I think a lot of the older generation find this rediscovery of Marxism and critique of capitalism quite disorienting.
Annoying.
Because they feel they've done that. They bought the T-shirt. They were active in this or that group in the 70s or 60s, and they've moved on. Whereas a younger generation have are discovering it with quite a lot of enthusiasm. And of course, the big difference between France and the US, for example, is that no institutional bases were created in France to defend or develop Marxist thought in the university system. The 68 generation didn't really leave anything behind, whereas
I didn't realize,
whereas with all its faults, the academicization of Marxism in the US does mean that there are places in the US where you could, in France it was impossible to do, until recently at least, a PhD in philosophy on Marx or a Marxist thinker. So you had to go through various substitutes if you were on the radical left. I think a second thing that's complicated is that post-structuralism doesn't really exist in France in the way that we understand it, as this kind of body of thought that, despite its differences, constitutes some kind of a foil or an enemy for Marxism, as it does in the Anglophone world. Individual thinkers are, Foucault, Derrida, etc., can be respected and dealt with, but they're not seen, or they weren't until recently seen, as this thing called post-structuralism or postmodernism. So I think it's another difference.
I always distinguished between post-structuralism, or for that matter deconstruction, or Foucauldianism, as on the one hand a worldview, and on the other hand a set of pretty nifty techniques that you could do things with. And I always criticize these things as a sort of a worldview, an overarching perspective from which to analyze society and politics. But I've found so much useful there that I could, extract and do things with. That's one point. In the United States, what got academicized and got an institutional basis in the university were first things like gender studies, or initially called women's studies, now gender and sexuality studies, Black studies originally, African American studies, or various kinds of BIPOC stuff, especially. What's interesting, within the last 5 years, many universities now have programs in capitalism studies. The new school where I teach has the Heilbronner Center for Capitalism Studies. Sven Beckert at Harvard has a capitalism studies program. There are several of these around. Maybe Adam Tooze has one at Columbia, I'm not quite sure. In any case, this is very interesting to me. This shows, along with some other developments I could name, like intersectionality theory, I take these, apart from whatever good work they do or not so good work they do, I take these as sort of signs of a very healthy hunger for integrative thinking, to get beyond group-specific, siloed, what we used to call identity political perspectives. And that was originally what was institutionalized. So I think that this is part of the larger sign of the times and of its radicalization and of the seriousness with people understand how serious our crisis is, and that it requires a much more coordinated and integrative kind of thinking as well as practice. And to me, the rise of capitalism studies, it's both about the taking Marxism seriously again as at least one element in what you need, but also, this more holistic and integrated, coordinated desire for a politics that is, genuinely counter-hegemonic, as opposed to just this group and that group.
If we had more time, I think we could have also talked about the role of transitional or thinkers who played an important role in that transition from the debates on post-structuralism to the debates on capitalism and Marxism today. People like Zizek and Badiou and so on, who were not identified as Marxist in a straightforward sense, and who, in Zizek's case, for example, published his first book in Laclau's post-Marxist series, and yet who played a very important role in re-legitimizing a language around, often quite radical language about about Marx, about capitalism, even
Revolution,
about revolution, Lenin, etc., and so forth.
Yeah,
But,
I was actually less engaged with and influenced by them.
Yeah.
I read them, but I wasn't. They didn't speak to me in the same way some of the other people we've mentioned.
no, I think they probably played a role for younger people.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So talking about Foucault, Foucault's his persistence is quite remarkable when you think about it, and the ferocity of the arguments around Foucault still, maintain their bite, as it were. Foucault wars are going on, and there seems to be a double movement going on. On the one hand, with the publication of his early classes, you see more and more, and very careful discussion of his early work. There is a discussion around his engagement with Marxist thought, at least at the beginning of the early 70s. And on the other hand, there is a very strong debate about his work towards the end of the mid to late 70s, the debates that you referred to around neo-liberalism, his particular political role that Michael Christopherson, for example, talks about in French intellectuals against the left in that particular moment around 77, 78, with the rise of the Union of the Left and his sort of anti-communism. So there's this double movement going on, but the fire doesn't seem to have gone out of that debate around Foucault, whereas somebody like Derrida doesn't polarize in the same kind of way anymore.
I'm not so involved with or paying a lot of attention to these Foucault wars today. To me, I'm not so interested in returning to that very early work. I am interested in the lectures on biopolitics and all of that. And I have engaged with them, not in writing, but in some round tables and discussions and things, and have found some interesting stuff there. Somewhat technical stuff about the relation between ordo-liberalism and the Chicago School and all of that. There's some interesting material there, but I am not. I don't follow closely these debates, and in the circles that I move in, these are not the burning issues. There is much more argument now about decoloniality and that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
So you mentioned American pragmatism, you mentioned French post-structuralist thought, and also figures like Bourdieu. Let's talk about Germany and the German influence. So, as you said, you sort of affiliate, broadly speaking, to a critical theory tradition. And you've written a lot on that. You've written some very powerful critiques, for example, of Habermas. I was wondering, can you explain to a younger person why Habermas is so interesting? Because, a lot of us can see the attraction for Adorno, for Benjamin, for Horkheimer. And Habermas just seems to be such a guardian of middle-of-the-road, liberal conservative, common sense, he's somewhat critical, but, very strictly limited in his criticism, certainly not in any way an anti-capitalist today. Is it partly just because of the biographical nature of the fact that you engaged with his early work at the time that it was being published or translated into English? Or do you think that there really is a core of Habermas's thought that, younger generations who are interested in anti-capitalist thought should be engaging with much more, perhaps vigorously than they are today?
I think Habermas wrote 3 great books, which should be counted within the Marxian world in the large sense. The Public Sphere book, his first book, is a magnificent book. He he discovers, it's a real discovery, this idea of the public sphere, the bourgeois public sphere as an historical phenomenon. He tries to trace its development, and which becomes a decline story, and tries to give a critical account of its limits and so on and so forth. This is a real contribution to Marxism. It's not a perfect book. I have lots of criticisms of it, but so what? Second important Marxist book, Legitimation Crisis. This is the crisis theory of social democracy. He's arguing that just because, of course, it's a historical moment, right? Just because the crisis doesn't take the form of economic falling rate of profit, although maybe actually it did later and he missed that, but just because it doesn't take that form doesn't mean that capitalism has eliminated its crises. It's merely displaced them onto these other realms. Again, I don't agree with it. I've written critically about it, but this is a major, along with Offa and other theorists about the contradictions of the welfare state. This is Marxist work, in my opinion. And then I would put also at least the latter part of Volume 2 of the Theory of Communicative Action, the theory of the inner colonization of the life world. He's trying to say that, sort of following Weber in a sense, that the critique of commodification is not enough. It has to be joined to the critique of bureaucratization. These are the sort of twin systemic forces in capitalist societies. And again, he's writing about the last days of the social democratic welfare state, and about how together, this links up with the Foucault thing we were talking about before, how this ends up sort of rewriting people's lived experiences and unhappinesses, right, in this clientelist, legalistic idiom. This is, I think these are all three real contributions to Marxism. I wrote my own little version of it that tried to avoid some of the more nostalgic conservative trappings that he, you're right, he brings to it. I wrote an early paper called Struggle Over Needs, which was exactly about this question of who defines needs, using Foucault, who thinks it's only the social workers who have any say on this. I was trying to introduce the social movement contestation and the people who were trying to marketize everything. So it was already, I've learned so much from Habermas, but you are absolutely right that there is a kind of, pro-American gratitude for the second chance that the U.S. gave them, which is quite moving in terms of his biography, of course. But for someone like me, who is anti-American to the core, coming out of the belly of the beast, this is too much. I will say that he wrote one of the most thoughtful things coming out of Germany on Ukraine.
Sure.
Very thoughtful.
For German standards.
Yeah. So, look, he's an important public intellectual in Germany. Having said all of that in his defense, I would agree that just as post-structuralist thought was a sort of path out of Marxism for the French New Left, for most people who engaged with Habermas, that was a path to liberalism out of Hegelian Marxism. Not me, not everyone, but the part of notice what I did not mention. Between Facts and Norms, which everyone thinks is the great masterpiece, to me this is rank. I invented a word, politicism. By analogy with economism, you think everything can be reduced to the political organization. Therefore, you need only talk about radical democracy. You don't have to say a word about capitalism. this is, completely idealist. So, and I'm not saying the work doesn't have anything to say about capitalism, but that's been the reception, and that's where people take it. So, last point on this is autobiographical for me. As a new leftist, I encountered Marcuse. This is how I became introduced to the Frankfurt School. I read One-Dimensional Man. It was, as an undergraduate, it was absolutely riveting and a kind of explosive. It allowed me to, this is exactly how I felt about what passed for critical discourse around me. This, of course, it was wrong in the sense that it wasn't. It turned out within a couple of years that, that one-dimensionality was completely ruptured. But I discovered the Frankfurt School through Marcuse, who was the only one of the bunch that was truly on the side of the New Left, truly. Then in graduate school, when I wanted to follow, learn more about the Frankfurt School, of course, Habermas was riding high. He was the go-to guy. So there was no choice. You had to. I wasn't interested in it sort of in an antiquarian way, but what it was doing in the present and what resources it would give us for critique. So there was no choice but to engage with him. But I was sort of the bad girl in the Habermasian group of my generation, and I have no regrets about that. I still admire him in many ways, and as I say, 3 great books. That's if anyone says that I wrote 3 great books that contributed, I would be more than happy.
Sure. And what's interesting, perhaps, about the present conjuncture is that there's now a rediscovery of other strands of 60s and 70s radical German thought. So Hans-Jürgen Karl, the value form
Yes.
people, the Sohn Rettel, and so on and so forth. So we now perhaps have a wider kind of perspective on
Yes, and one thing that is giving me enormous pleasure and satisfaction is to see my dear friend Moishe Poststone's work getting the reception it deserves. So many young people are interested in Poststone, and that is, a version of this value form theory.
Sure. And would you say that the same kind of return to the question of capitalism and Marxism and so on that you observe, at least in some sectors in the US and in France and the UK, is that happening in Germany, or is it a more complicated story?
Yes, it is. I don't want to toot my own horn, but when I gave these Benjamin lectures on the 3 Faces of Labor that you and I talked about, this was in the Haus der Kultur der Welt. It was 1,000 people. It was full every night. Young people want to hear about capitalism in Germany. It's huge. I was at another thing with Mika Brie from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Jeremy Corbyn. Thousands of people. It's an absolute moment in Germany too. In Berlin, at least. That was all Berlin. It's true.
So you mentioned several times your origins in the American New Left. Perhaps you could say a little bit about that context,
Yes.
And how it compares to the present kind of radicalization of young people, what differences or similarities there might be.
So first of all, I have to say that I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, which was a Jim Crow segregated city, legally de jure segregated. For me, the formative political experience was desegregation. When I was in junior high school and in high school, SNCC, H. Rap Brown was in Cambridge, Maryland, not far from where I was. It was an explosive moment for me. I grew up in a Roosevelt Democratic liberal family. Parents were very pro-union and so on. But they moved as part of white flight when the neighborhood was being integrated into a suburb, and my adolescence was filled with fighting with my parents. You're hypocrites, you say you're for this, but you do that, blah, blah, blah. That's how I became a new leftist. There are many different routes to this. And then it was the classical trajectory, the Vietnam War. Again, I was very close to Washington at all the huge civil rights and anti-war marches, and so on. And it was at one of those marches that I first heard, and my memory isn't great. Oh, I have so many incredible memories. I first heard, it might have been Carl Davidson, was one of the SDS leaders, say, we have to name the system, and the system is imperialism. I had grown up, I don't think I'd ever heard the word imperialism before. You have to understand how we in the US, because of McCarthyism, unless you were from a red diaper family, which I was not, there was social amnesia. We were completely cut off. We had to sort of reinvent radical thinking, which is why we made so many mistakes, it must be said, reinventing the wheel or whatever. That was one important moment. I also heard someone who had been fired and blacklisted for Communist Party membership in McCarthy era give a talk at that big anti-war demonstration, which was the first one that allowed the communists to participate, in which the New Left took a courageous stand against anti-communism. I heard a man give a brilliant talk in tears, and I don't know who it was to this day, saying it's the first time he'd been able to give a public speech in 25 years. I mean, all of this made a huge impression on me, huge. And then by the time I went to university, it was 67, 60, no, I started at university in 65. So anyway, things were exploding quickly. And, I was, I can tell you a funny story. There was a period where I was very involved in the 65, 66 in anti-war, and I worked with with Noam Chomsky's sister-in-law, Judy Chomsky. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a draft resistance, Philadelphia draft resistance, and so we collected draft cards and burned them in big rallies and demos. Lots of clergy around. Everybody was talking about witnessing, and I come from a secular Jewish family. What is this witnessing? I have no idea what they're talking about. Then I was watching, I was very impressed with the moralism, the integrity of these people, the seriousness that they had, the religiosity, maybe because also in the civil rights movement, the black church and so on. So all of this made a kind of impression on me, coming from, like I say, this very secular, quasi-atheistic family. Then on TV, I'm watching Buddhist monks burn themselves up, and I'm literally walking around thinking to myself, but if you're really serious, if you're really against the war, why aren't you burning yourself up? 3 weeks later, I met some Trotskyists. And they said, there's another way. And so this is just to give you a sense of how the sense of extremity and radicalism without the formation that would have helped me find my way. Yeah. No, it was a wild time. So then I joined that wasn't a true Trotskyist group, but some kind of a quasi-Trotskyist groupuscule.
Which one was that?
It was, in those days, called the National Caucus or SDS Labor Committee. Lyndon LaRouche. Well, I left long before that, but yes. And we were always sort of in trouble.
Luxembourgist Trotskyists. Yeah.
Always in trouble in SDS because we were, I think, the only part of SDS that supported the New York teacher strike against community control of the schools, critical support. But so we were racist and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, lots of drama and then feminism. One thing that has occurred to me in retrospect, this was a France-U.S. contrast, because I just wrote something about this. I would say that in places like France, where the May '68 was at first a student affair and then basically a union affair and a general strike kind of atmosphere, that took one path. In the United States, the New Left was really centered on race, on anti-war, and therefore anti-imperialism more broadly. It was about the sort of, it was very third world oriented and very American race oriented. Feminism became strong, not as strong. This was a very different New Left in that sense. Just in terms of what I think of today, the sort of, in the French case, I would say it was kind of the exploitation problematic that became very central, along with the imagination and so on and so forth. For us, it was race and gender that were central. And in fact, many of the strongest American trade unions were anti-New Left because they were pro-Vietnam. Not all. Of course, black workers were different. They had an anti-Vietnam, anti-imperialist perspective, the radical ones. But a lot of the white working class was anti-New Left. That's totally different from here. And this might be why as our New Left dissolved and attenuated, which happened everywhere, the social movements that emerged were far less Marxist and oriented to the labor dimension of things, much more oriented either to questions about violence or reproductive rights or identity and humiliation and all that kind of stuff. I think in retrospect, the absence of a strong official labor connection. We all tried. Half the groups in factions within SDS were Worker Student Alliance and all this kind of stuff. But the truth of the matter is that the workers were pretty hostile.
And I mean, when one looks at when one reads your work, you have a very welcome kind of ecumenical notion of Marxism, and you cite beyond Marx and Engels, you cite Gramsci, you cite Luxemburg. More recently, you've been citing figures in the quote unquote black Marxist tradition, of course the Marxist feminist tradition, and so on. There were two names that I haven't come across, which are Lenin and Trotsky. Do they not figure at all in your intellectual framework, or you prefer not to talk about them because they raise other questions that distract?
I'm not sure why I haven't talked about them, and it's not a principled decision. It's probably just that, I don't know, not top of mind or what, who knows. But I can tell you that, speaking of black Marxism, I've been recently teaching and writing about Du Bois, and especially black Reconstruction. And I've become such an enthusiast that I go around telling everybody, this is on a par with Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. These are the two great masterpieces of Marxist historiography.
With the black Jacobins, perhaps, as well.
Perhaps. Okay. You're right. I should. Anyway, but Trotsky, someone who has been very important to me. Lenin, I just taught State and Revolution. I taught a class on socialism and anarchism with an Italian colleague who is an anarchist, comes from it honestly through a long family tradition. And I was pretty impressed with State and Revolution, it was a lot more interesting openness of thinking than I remembered from my youth. So, yeah, I'm not ruling out. Maybe, who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is it fair to say you've also been quite influenced, because you cited a lot the notion of core and periphery. So
Yes.
you've been much more influenced by, let's say, the Wallerstein world system school more than the Brennerite
Yes.
tradition.
Yes, but more through Arrighi than Wallerstein himself.
Right.
Of course, it's the same school in a sense, but yeah, because I look, Brenner's a great thinker, and I'm also influenced by Ellen Wood to some degree, but I do think that for what I want to do, and probably I would even go further and say what anyone should want to do, you've got to frame it globally. You really do. So, I mean, with neoliberalization, it's so obvious that it's the change in the rules of the road at the level of global finance, right, with the dismantling of Bretton Woods and so on, how that really it licenses and sets the stage for everything that goes on within various states and so on and so forth. So, again, I just finished teaching another course on rethinking class, where we read E.P. Thompson, of course, and all of those and went back to all those debates with Perry and Ellen Wood. They wrote a magnificent and fair-minded piece. I guess it was an NLR piece. I'm not sure. Kind of sorting the good criticism from those that missed the boat and so on. But this whole problem of development within one country does seem problematic to me. I think, which is not to say that there aren't all these magnificent insights in Thompson and Brenner and elsewhere, but I'm thinking of the original Brenner debates. I mean, of course, now he's done the turbulence of the whole, but. I've become more and more convinced that the global is the frame for almost everything.
Sure.
And that it makes a difference in how you think about things.
But one doesn't have to think of the global necessarily in terms of core and periphery. I mean, one could think of it more in terms of uneven and combined development. One could also, the rise of the BRICS poses a whole kind of problem for a certain version of world systems theory.
Totally. When I use language of... it's interesting that you say this, because someone else said something similar to me and didn't like that language, and something we were writing together for the same reason. But I have to say, when I use core and periphery language, first of all, I try to be careful in terms of what period I'm talking about. Today I would talk about the historic core, or the or the BRICS, or something like that. I don't. Maybe this is a mistake on my part, but I feel that I can use this language because it's kind of, everybody uses it, and I don't mean to affiliate against combined and uneven development. If it's read that way, then I should change the way I'm writing, perhaps. Yeah.
And lastly, on the biographical question, what is your, since this is an interview for Verso, what has been your historical relationship to New Left Review and to this?
Well, I always admired it and thought that, all the fantastic translations and the sort of, for someone who's an English speaker, the development of English Marxism from Thompson and Williams and Hill and so on, the great historians, and then Stuart Hall and Perry Anderson and Tariq Ali, and and Ellen Wood moves there and so on. This is was for me always just such an outstanding intellectual tradition. And by contrast, I felt that the U.S. New Left did not, although there was lots of good work going on, it did not develop an institution like NLR that could really preserve. Okay, we academicized some things, but we didn't. That's very different from a real intellectual Marxist tradition, and I'm aware of, although I wasn't personally involved, that a magazine that used to be called the Socialist Revolution, and then changed its name to Socialist Review, and then changed its name to something even more, I don't know what. They had huge fights about whether to become like take NLR as a model, or whether to be a more activist-oriented. And of course, they chose the activist-facing, and that was a mistake. I mean, we only had Telos, and then that became so,
weird.
Sort of sectarian and nutty and so on. So I always looked to New Left Review as the place where very serious intellectual work was done.
Did Perry Anderson's book Considerations on Western Marxism, did that have an impact on you? I mean, you continue to be interested in Western Marxism despite the ferocious criticisms he makes of it within that book.
I didn't read it until much later.
Right.
And I don't know, I think at that time I was very focused on less on settling theoretical accounts with the Frankfurt School or Gramsci or whatever, than in taking what I could from there and trying to figure out what I thought was happening, doing a kind of a critical theory. I had gone through this phase of trying to quote-unquote settle accounts with Habermas, with Derrida, with Foucault, with Rorty. But at a certain point I said, enough of this, I want to develop my own critical theory. And so I didn't encounter that book until later, and I can't say that it influenced me that much.
Okay, so let's talk about your more recent work then. Yeah. Tell me if you think this is a correct characterization. My sort of perception of what you're trying to do is, again, you're trying to occupy what I would characterize as quite a lonely position in the US left at the moment, which seems very polarized between, on the one hand, what is called quote-unquote class reductionism, and on the other hand, various forms of more or less radical identity politics. There is obviously, of course, the very establishment and neoliberal progressivist forms of identity politics, but there are also people who want to describe every struggle as intrinsically anti-capitalist or a class struggle, despite the forms it may take, and so on. So you have this very polarized political intellectual scene in the US, and obviously it's focused mainly around the question of race, although gender and increasingly now ecology are being inscribed within it. And what you're trying to do with your notion of the enlarged conception of capitalism, and thinking of capitalism as something that's much wider than simply the quote-unquote economic process of capitalism, you're trying to bridge that gap and simultaneously carry out a critique both of class reductionism and of identity politics. Is that a fair characterization of what you're trying to do?
Yes, that is a fair characterization. I mean, what I would, I actually don't feel that it's that lonely. I have to say, before I get to the details, that that the work I've been doing in this vein gets a lot of uptake, and when I look at things like the the March 8th feminist strike stuff, I feel that there is some kind of a large and growing body of people who want that center position between the two. I don't feel alone. I feel that I'm one of maybe a group of people who are articulating that position, and I think it is having some good response. Okay, so, but on the substance...
When I said lonely, I meant simply in terms of you're one of the few intellectual voices who's articulating that position, not that, there's no interest in it or
Okay, fair enough. Now on the substance, I think your description is absolutely correct. What my idea is that we need to look at not just at the official economy in a sense of the sphere of labor and social relations and so on that are monetized and marketized and that lead directly to the production and realization of surplus value, but at the relationship of that to what I think of as its background conditions of possibility. And by that I mean the social reproductive sphere, whether we're talking about families, communities, state agencies, or even increasingly for-profit enterprises that are monetizing care work and so on. That's one. You don't have the official economy without all of this background of so-called care work or social reproductive labor. And by the same token, you don't have it without nature treated as a source of free or almost free, use Jason Moore's term, cheap, right, stuff that capital can simply, free ride on, take what it wants, no obligation to repair or replenish. Same with care work, right? It just helps itself, basically. It doesn't want to pay for it. And I would say the same thing about a significant fund of unfree or semi-free labor and land. It's part of the nature again, but it intersects with which is essentially stolen or expropriated, not exploited, not via labor contracts and all those legal niceties, and certainly not paid its true reproduction costs. That too, I think, has historically and in the present remains a background condition for the kind of surplus value accumulation that is supposed to that goes on, where it does. And then finally, public goods, infrastructure, capacity for regulation and maintaining order and so on that we associate with states and the political. That's all part of capitalism. You don't have capital accumulation without all that stuff. So my idea is, let's stop equating capitalism with and say it's an economic system. It's actually a large institutionalized social order that institutes what I think is a very perverse and contradictory relation between the official economy and all of this stuff that it simultaneously needs, but is also primed to trash, to deplete, to destabilize, to toxify, and so on. And so from there, I get to the idea that first of all, Marxists have paid too much attention to surplus value and not enough attention to profit. I will accept the stipulation that only exploited labor power produces surplus value. This is a technical question, fine. But profit depends on much, much more. It depends on all these inputs whose reproduction costs are not paid. And we on the left, we in Marxism need to pay a lot more attention to all these other components. That's how we can connect the ecological problematic, the race and empire problematic, and indigenous problematic. That's how we can connect the gender problematic and the problem of not the sort of the crisis of governmentality, of governance, and of that matter of hegemony. These things are all part of the current crisis of capitalism. There is a ticking time bomb of finance that will explode, I'm convinced, and that has continues. And there are, of course, severe livelihood strains and crises as well. It's not that the economic is not a big part of the current crisis, but it is interwoven inextricably with all of these other things. And that's why I believe that it is a true general crisis of the sort that is quite rare in the history of capitalism. That doesn't mean it will be resolved anytime soon, or it certainly doesn't mean it will be resolved in a good way. But that's our situation, and in order to understand this situation and to figure out what we can do to at least improve the chances of an emancipatory resolution, to do that, we absolutely need a framework that is this kind of enlarged view of what capitalism is, that recognizes that it has not just economic contradictions, but also ecological contradiction, a social reproductive contradiction, a political contradiction, a racial imperial contradiction. This is all part of capitalism, in my view. And I think we can do that in a way that is analytically precise. That is, it's not just smushing everything together. I've tried to do it in a way that really says that the system is built on a set of institutionalized divisions. It's built on a distinction between production and reproduction, between society and nature, between economy or state and market, economy and polity, free and unfree labor. That's the Du Boisian idea, the global color line. These divisions are as structural as the division between capital and labor. And they have to be central and integrated along with the capital-labor division and all the absolutely non-surpassable insights of Marxism in its more familiar form. All of that has to be integrated into a critical theory of capitalist society for our time.
First question then, why not use the old-fashioned term of social formation rather than enlarged conception of capitalism or institutionalized social order? Isn't that exactly what the notion of social formation is trying to do, saying that?
Well, I think of social formation as introducing the sort of historical and temporal variability into a discourse centered on mode of production. And I'm trying to say that I'm not trying to talk about regional or national or periodized variability. I mean, I do want to do that too, but what I've said so far is a structural account of what the structure of the system is. So I would say it's closer to mode of production than social formation. The social formation, as I've understood it, is about how the more restricted economic notion is implanted within something larger. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that these distinctions I've drawn are structural. This is not the context, the non-structural context in which the structural is implanted. For me, it is structural.
Right,
that's an important difference, I think.
Yeah, and I suppose you would be quite hostile, understandably, to the notion of social formation as a articulation of modes of production. Yes. to try and understand unfree labor, for example. You want to really center it on the capitalist nature.
Like I've taught many times Stuart Hall's great essay on race and articulation. And it's so, I love especially the early parts when he goes through all of the South African debates about an economic perspective, a sociological perspective, and this idea of articulation of modes of production. I have to say then that by the end, when he gets to Althusser, I told my students that I want to quote Larry David. I mean, to me that doesn't lead to anything that fruitful. But I love the early parts, and I am coming down on the side that we are not talking about the articulation of different modes of production. Maybe at some very early origin point or something, but no, we are talking about one mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, and its own internal differentiated quality, because the if you want to use the word articulation, the articulation of the parts is part of the structure. These are not two different modes that are articulated.
Okay, and you distinguish between what you call the foreground and the background,
Yes.
the sphere of exploitation, and then the spheres of expropriation, which are, as you say, social reproduction, nature, the question of empire and race, and then the political. So one of the criticisms that has come up of this, and it comes up also at various points in your discussion in the book with Rahel Yegi, is that you are reproducing a two systems theory, or a binary kind of set of oppositions. Yeah. And one thing that did surprise me, you come from a Hegelian Marxist or a critical theory tradition, and that there was a whole way of trying to think through that problem through the notion of dialectics, dialectical unity, and so on. And then there was an alternative tradition, the Althusserian tradition, which tries to think of it in terms of overdetermination, which is a term you use in that discussion, but I think in a looser way than the Althusserians would have used it. So there are these two ways of trying to think about how you relate these different spheres together, and you don't take a strong position really about how you would think this relationship. Use various terms like articulation, imbrication, and so on. And I think that's something that you've been pushed a little bit on. Where would you stand on that now? How would you think about the specific nature of the connections?
Well, I probably need to think this through more deeply and seriously than I have to date. But what I would say now, in any case, is that I don't think I fit into either of those two things. I don't think this is quite the dialectical totality of Hegelian Marxism, and I don't think it's the articulation of levels in the Althusserian model. I think it's something else. Now, I want to respond to the idea, though, that it's somehow binaristic. That I don't agree with. It's true that in my presentations of this approach, I always start with Marx and say, just as he went beneath the hidden abode of the market to production, so I want to go, beneath that, and so on. That's a kind of issue of presentation, we could say. What you call the foreground and what you call the background really depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to explain the relation between Marx's analysis of capital accumulation and these other things I'm interested in, then it makes sense to talk about foreground, background. But you could equally talk about, put social reproduction in the foreground and the other in the background. In fact, I had a kind of a little epiphany during the pandemic when everyone was saying, oh, this puts the spotlight on social reproduction. Now everybody sees how important that is. and I was being interviewed by people who were saying, is talking about that. And I said, well, yeah, but, I sort of had the opposite thing. Like, we don't have any masks. We don't have any ventilators in New York. There are no supply chains that are working. Doesn't this also reveal how important production is? So, it really depends on what you're looking at. And it's not, I don't think it's binary. I know that question has been raised. And then I guess part of me wants to say, well, if in some sense it is binary, so what? I mean, is that like a great sin?
Well,
So
I suppose the danger would be that it could devolve into a form of pluralism or neo-Weberianism, where you have these various, Michael Mann, you have ideological power, and you have political power and military power, and so on. And again, the old issue of primacy always comes back within Marxism. So it's how to retain some notion of primacy, but without it becoming a form of strict determinism.
So this is not like a Michael Mann story about different sources of power or anything like that. This is an attempt to put within one frame things that are often separated, and it's an argument against so-called dual system theory or triple system theory, or that's another model of articulation. How do you articulate these different systems?
Or intersectionality.
Well, I want to get to that. Absolutely, yes. At least some versions of intersectionality. It depends. No, God, just again, remind me of the question.
So how precisely would you think of these relations without falling into pluralism? Or...
Well, I guess in using the conditions of possibility language, which is Kantian, right? It's these are not exactly causal relations. It's that you can't have this without this. That doesn't mean you have to have this in exactly one form or that in exactly one form, because there are huge struggles over what the relationship between the family and the factory should be, and so on and so forth. But I'm using this quasi-transcendental language of Kant in order to get away from the idea that I'm giving a theory of causality that says this is primary and that. This is necessary for that, but that is equally necessary for this. And when you have a system that essentially prioritizes limitless accumulation, then you basically are setting up these other things as reservoirs to be cannibalized, and then you are essentially implanting in a deep way crisis tendencies that may or may not erupt in acute form now and then. That's the idea.
Okay. The way this has come up, I think, also methodologically in the question around social reproduction and gender oppression is whether you think of the relationship between capitalism and gender oppression as logical or historical. So is it essentially to do with the inheritance of previous forms of gender oppression, which are then transformed and refunctioned under capitalism?
Yeah.
Or is it something deeper than that? Which means that capitalism necessitates gender oppression and other forms of expropriation.
I will try to explain my view. First of all, I'm most interested in the structural question, and one line that I have is that I'll happily let the historians figure out how this came about, and so on. Obviously, there was gender asymmetry, various forms of male domination, female subordination, long before capitalism, which, by the way, I don't think I would say about race. We can come back to that. But in the case of gender, that's very clear. So I'm not saying that I'm against the idea that capitalism took it over and refunctioned it, but I want to put the stress on how distinctive male domination under capitalism is for systemic reasons, because of what capitalism is, versus various pre-capitalist forms. So I don't like ahistorical or trans-historical talk of patriarchy or or male domination in this trans-historical sense. I'm interested in capitalism and what it does with that. Now, I think that capitalism requires a separation of some kind between production and reproduction. I think that is absolutely a structural necessity, and that if those two realms are going to, and the work that's involved in those two realms are going to be assigned to two different categories of people, then whoever does the social reproductive work is going to be feminized and is going to be subordinated. In that sense, you could say it is structural. Now, the one interesting question that arises is, does it need two distinct populations? Is it possible that everyone could do some of both? And would that still be capitalism? That's an interesting idea. I tried to work it through with race also. We have to have a significant amount of unfree work, in my opinion, or semi-free work in capitalism. Not everyone can have a perfectly proper labor contract. And as long as those are two sharply divided populations, so you will have a racialized, stigmatized, violable, expropriable group that will be, sort of marked out as different and lesser. But again, is it possible that capitalism might evolve, or is it even evolving into a way in which more and more people are hybrids? They're doing both exploited and expropriated work, or their exploited work is becoming degraded so that it's not so different from expropriated work. They're losing labor rights and so on and so forth. And we could pose the same question with respect to gender. Some kind of a form of capitalism where everybody has some primary care responsibilities, maybe has a slightly shorter paid work week, et cetera, et cetera. This is certain. Some people have this as an ideal for what equality is. I can't rule out on logical grounds, but I would say, with respect to path dependency, I don't see any way in which we're going to get there from where we are now, because the history is such that those who have been merely exploited and not are fiercely resisting degradation to expropriation, and often respond by virulent racism. Something like that could go on as well on the gender, on the production reproduction line. So I think that these divisions themselves are structurally necessary. Who occupies and how they're treated, maybe there's a little more wiggle room, but not that much, in my opinion.
I don't know what your view of the Soviet type systems is, but whether you consider them to have been some form of capitalism, like many state capitalist schools claim, or a non-capitalist or a post-capitalist mode of production. But certainly there you see, as the famous book "Sex Was Better Under Socialism."
Is it a famous book? What?
Sex was better under socialism.
Godze Christian.
Yeah, you see very different relations in terms of gender roles. Mm-hmm. You don't see an abolition of gender oppression, but you certainly see a very different configuration. Does the question of the experience of the Eastern Bloc have any influence on the way you think about the relationship between?
I would say that the stress in the Eastern Bloc has been the classical socialist idea that the most important thing to promote gender equality is to get the women into the paid workforce. That was the main idea. And it's not that there was no recognition of social reproduction and not some development of some efforts to socialize some of that work. There was. In that respect, I would say maybe even a country that's not usually held up as a model, the East Germany was quite good. But the main focus was always on paid work, both because it was there was the sort of old idea of Engels that that's the route to liberation, but also because of the situation of playing catch up and trying to industrialize rapidly and so on. So, there was a whole nother motive, you could say, and the result was. A real double shift for women that was not at all matched by men. And, the forms of, at first we had, interestingly, I remember in the early days after '89, meeting Eastern European and Soviet women intellectuals and being told, that feminism was their problem because they associate feminism with the idea that they had to do paid work and couldn't. That was a short-lived moment. Fortunately, they began to get other ideas about the story. But on the other hand, I have to say that I've been very struck in China, even, and maybe I've been there more than I've been to Russia, interestingly. China really did, without achieving anything perfect, really did do some very important work in liberating Chinese women, the Chinese communism. Okay, now there's this explosion of consumerism and sexualization and so on, or the sort of the current situation is different. But I think I've learned, I would say there's some positive and some negative, and that it's an object, it serves as a certain kind of object lesson about how you need to be able to do more than one thing at once.
I can see how the notion of expropriation works pretty well with the questions of social reproduction, with the question of nature, and the question of politics. It seems to be more complicated on the question of race, because arguably you have quite a US-centric conception of what racism is and how it functions. So it's essentially focused on the question, the experience of African Americans and perhaps also other racialized groups in the US, from slavery to the present. Would you accept that? I mean, where, for example, into your picture of expropriation and race, would anti-Semitism or Islamophobia fit in, on the one hand, and where do you see this connection between expropriation and capitalism in China, Japan,
right.
Indonesia, other places that are very much right. capitalist powers, but are very different in their right. relationship to race?
So, I can. It's certainly true that even given the biography I described, that American so-called race relations, and above all the black-white color line, has been, very much top of mind for me for decades of my life. But I don't want to concede the point that my approach is somehow too stamped by that. Because first of all, equally important in the United States is indigenous dispossession. That's so central to our history, as it would be to many settler colonial states. No, and this goes back to the Vietnam. That's all the other important biographical point. This sort of attempt to, back to the world system thing, to think about colonialism, imperialism, the so-called discoveries. This is what institutes a global color line. It's not just black and white, but it's dark and less dark. And of course, we can find versions of it. England, Ireland, which is also almost, a racialized kind of thing, or it was. And then we have, this becomes so powerful that even countries, hello, I'm being distracted, even countries like China, which has its Han superior kind of thing going. Of course, it's today, whatever else we call it, is an imperial power in relation to extractivism in Africa and elsewhere, especially Africa. This is another version of that global color line, despite the fact that at one period they were on the receiving end and so on. And now I think Islamophobia has everything to do with the global color line. These are in France, they're the ex-colonials. They're the immigrants from the Maghreb and so on. And the United States decides it's going to remake the whole Middle East and invades Iraq and precipitates a huge refugee crisis that lands not on us, but on Europe. It has everything to do with color line and the history of colonialism and now post-colonialism and post-colonial imperialism. To me, we have a global color line. How you work out, what this means intranationally in a country like Brazil is somewhat complicated. But don't you think in France there's such a clear
sure.
binarism, really, of color?
Sure.
Yeah.
What about anti-Semitism, though?
Well, anti-Semitism, I suspect anti-Semitism is less about expropriation. Well, look, the history of anti-Semitism is complicated. But let's talk about so-called eliminationist anti-Semitism, the Holocaust and so on. To me, this is an idea I got, I think, from Oliver Cromwell Cox, if I'm not mistaken. Not that he says this, but to me that's closer to certain forms of homophobia, where the idea is not to take their wealth or to turn them into a subordinate caste of menial labor, but to just get the fuck rid of them. I shouldn't say that. Get rid of them. They shouldn't exist at all. Whereas a lot of the kind of racism I'm talking about is about turning people into a servile caste of degraded laborers, or to expel them and just take their land and so on. So I think that form of anti-Semitism might belong in a different category. Although, there may be other forms of anti-Semitism that are closer. But anti-Semitism is in my view, a racism of some kind, for sure.
Right. And one of the things you do in your work...
Can I?
Yeah.
Can I just say, I think that Morsh Poststone's analysis of anti-Semitism is really interesting. You could say it's the anti-capitalism of fools or whatever. It's about the difficulty of recognizing capital as a power that is, in a sense, abstract. The need to personify it, that aspect of anti-Semitism, that they are the bankers and the bloodsuckers who are, that aspect of it relates to this question of an abstract form of domination, expropriation, and the difficulty, maybe in a way this relates to Jameson too, it's difficult to cognitively map it for a lot of people. And it's so much easier to say it's them, this concrete group of people. Anyway, yeah.
So one of the things that you do in your work is that you try and historicize this relationship between the foreground and the background, or and you have this periodization of four periods: mercantile capitalism,
Yes.
liberal imperialism,
Colonial, yeah.
capitalism, state managed capitalism, and neoliberalism.
Yeah.
That seems to be very much, if I'm not mistaken, borrowed from the regulation school.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
So you don't feel that the criticisms that the regulation school received were particularly devastating. You think it's
Well, I want to know exactly what criticisms you mean, but the main difference, I think the periodization is perfectly serviceable, but the main difference is they're looking mainly at state market relations as they affect exploited workers, and I'm looking at how a whole bunch of things shift from one phase to the next, including the relation between production and reproduction, the relation to nature, yes, the relation of economy and polity, and also how the color line shifts.
Sure.
Yeah. But what criticism do you
Well, I mean,
exactly?
Again, Robert Brenner, but others have developed quite powerful criticisms of regulation school, arguing that the whole model really is very problematic.
It's too nation-centered? No.
Well, there's a whole number of criticisms, but
it comes too much from the French. Yeah, but I think, I hope that what I have done in sort of lifting those phases is something different enough that I think I wouldn't be so vulnerable to that critique.
Okay. Should we just end on some questions about politics, contemporary politics?
Yeah.
We're in a kind of odd situation at the moment in terms of left politics globally. There's the left populist phase that was represented in some countries by, for example, Bernie Sanders or Podemos or Syriza. In Greece, his seems to have ended. We've had some very depressing election results in Greece, for example, and today in the Spanish regional and local elections.
Oh, I didn't hear what.
Yeah, big victory for the right.
Oh, God.
And the far right. France is perhaps an exception to that. And at the same time, in the US, there is a real revival of some kind of left organizing capacity around DSA and so on. But in a context, again, where what you called neoliberal progressivism is very much, in control of the situation in the Democratic Party. It's not really facing a left challenge that seems to bother it very much. So what is your kind of assessment of that political conjuncture that we're in? Do you think, broadly speaking, the positive signs that you've seen are still accumulating, or that we may be in facing a more severe, longer period of defeats?
Well, of course, it's very hard to say. I don't have a crystal ball, but my hunch is that we haven't seen the end of these leftist, left populist, in some cases left social democratic, in some cases democratic social, whatever they are, and they're more than one thing. I don't think we've seen the end of that. I think that it returns as it did first with Occupy, then with the Sanders and Corbyn and so on. Mélenchon, which, as you say, is a relative bright spot here. No, I see things they percolate, they appear, they die down. I don't think we've seen the end. Now, does that mean that I'm optimistic in general? Not necessarily. I really don't know. But I do think there's no question that we're in a very severe crisis, that many, many people are not willing to toe the line with the established parties and are looking for alternatives. It's absolutely true, I would say, from today's perspective, that the principal beneficiary has been the populist right, the authoritarian right. And our only hope, in my opinion, is to develop that left populist or socialist alternative, and to absolutely refuse the blackmail coming from the progressive neoliberals who tell us that the fascists are at the door, come and scurry behind our skirts. We can protect you. You don't split the left, as if they're part of the left. This is exactly the wrong thing to do, because those are the folks that create the conditions that spawns the right in the first place, and that's a vicious circle. Our only hope is to try to develop this. And look, there's a huge amount of radical ecology stuff going on, and the radical feminism in many countries, especially in Latin America and Southern Europe, has developed a whole new face, the face of anti-debt, anti-austerity, linked up with violence against women, linked up with reproductive rights and so on. This is a very different kind of feminism. This is the kind of feminism I was longing for a long time. So maybe that will spread as well. Black Lives Matter and allied movements is a complicated formation with many different currents. Lots of young people of color are reading Marx, coming a world of study groups emerging from within the movement for Black Lives. We don't know where that's going to go. I could point to, even apart from DSA, which is splintered with horrific factional fights over all those old questions, Jacobin, some of its, some of its leaders are more, to my mind, social democratic than actually socialist, but it doesn't matter. It's bringing in huge numbers of young people. It's become a publishing empire, an international in itself, with multilinguistic formations all over Europe and Latin America. This is all great. Where it's going to lead is it? Who knows? But I do think that in the end, if we're lucky, we'll have a real three-way fight between the right-wing populists, our left, whatever we call it, and the neoliberals. Historically, when that kind of situation has developed, the capitalist class has basically put the fascists in power. Better them than the left. Maybe they'll play that game again.
Plutôt Pétain que le Front Populaire,
Oui.
c'est in France.
Oui. Better Hitler than the Communist Party in Germany, or Mussolini than, So, at every point, that's what they've done. It's interesting that the U.S. was the exception in that period, and they found another path. And they found the other path to sort of ally with the labor movements and so on. Of course, one is optimistic or pessimistic depending upon the moment, but we can't be too swayed by that. We have to stick to what the situation demands and see what we can do to shift it. And I did want to say something. Maybe now, I don't know if you have it on your agenda, about intersectionality.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because that word, is a buzzword today. And, it originally meant the claims of Black women that mainstream feminism on the one hand and mainstream anti-racism on the other hand were unable to clarify their distinctive situation at the kind of nexus of sexism and racism. Then it became more a a claim to link the different systems of oppression, a new version of dual or triple systems theory, then now I think for a lot of people, it is just a marker for the hunger for an integrated perspective. I think that's what people mean more and more by intersectionality. And
it's more of a question than an answer.
Exactly. And the political impulse is a good one. I'm completely on board with the impulse. And what I think that I've been doing in my recent work is giving an account of what the larger social matrix is that generates the different subject positions, the different experienced harms, and their intersections. And in this new work that I've been doing, that part of it is even more pronounced.
One of the other debates, apart from your debates with Habermas and so on, that attracted a lot of interest on the left was your debate with Judith Butler on distribution and recognition.
Yeah.
Which was a very important debate, and I think probably marked a certain turn in the sort of intellectual atmosphere. How do you feel about that debate now, and do you feel that your positions have converged or got any closer, or would you say that still the terms of that debate are very much the terms that they were when it happened?
Well, I would say that that Judith and I share many political commitments and political impulses, so to speak, but we still work within very different frameworks. From my point of view, her framework, which is, involves a Foucauldian element, a Lacanian or a Macleanian element, a Derridian element, I believe, she would disagree fiercely, that her framework is actually inadequate to address the questions she wants to address. She certainly wants to develop, to be a kind of anti-capitalist thinker. But I don't think that framework, I don't think you can do it with the resources that she has so far mobilized at her disposal. So, look, that earlier debate was in part, in my opinion, based on a kind of misunderstanding. She attributed a kind of base superstructure picture to me, which I didn't hold. I thought it was extremely interesting that was the first time I ever saw her really try to do social theory. And then she came up with this kind of seamless thing and with no cracks. So, it was what was interesting about it to me was that it was a debate on the terrain of social theory. And I don't think she's done much on that terrain before. She's such a brilliant thinker. She comes up with, she's wonderful, new ideas, one after another, fountain of creativity. But if only I could convince her to, I know she's written about Marx. There's that little volume that for that Edition Sciences Sociales.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's in English.
There's a short version in Radical Philosophy, I think.
Okay. Yeah, you should publish it. But fundamentally, what organizes her thinking is something else. And I learn from her all the time. But no, I have to say, insofar as it makes sense to say what the outcome of that debate was, I'm very comfortable in arguing what I argued, and I believe it was right. And I don't know, what the world thinks, but I'm satisfied with it.
And what about, don't you think there's a generational aspect, which is that in a context where political organizations have largely collapsed, that would have helped, for all their faults, prioritize and organize forms of investment of time and energy, that there's now a tendency amongst some younger people, at least, to hyper-politicize their personal relationships.
I think this is kind of built in, I would say probably to capitalism in general, but to American capitalism in a huge way. I mean, we live we live in this sphere that Eli Zaretsky called personal life, which has an institutional basis in capitalist society, and especially in the sort of precariat of those who hope to be in the professional managerial strata and so on. You know, I mean, everything is so focused on making connections and networking. The political economy, in a way, demands it. That and being visible and having an online presence and getting as many likes and hits and clicks and, you know, so there's a sense in which this is a kind of hypertrophied, you know, hothouse where all sorts of moral panics and paranoia set in. I see it very much, and you know, too much attention to microaggressions, which are real, and I'm certainly not defending them. But where's the macro here? Where is the macro? But I see the two things going on. I see more and more people doing that, and more people becoming disillusioned with it, and looking for like intersectionality in the sense of a more integrated, larger perspective. So both things are happening.
Okay, and then maybe we can finish then on your new work, your Benjamin Lecter's on the three faces of labor.
Yeah.
Could you say something about what you're developing in that work?
Yeah, this is my next book, now in progress, and it was inspired by W.E.B Du Bois. I mentioned earlier what a huge fan I am of Black Reconstruction, which is a history of 19th century U.S. Civil War, emancipation, radical Reconstruction, and what Du Bois calls the counter-revolution of property. It's got a stunning idea, which is that in this period, the United States had two labor movements, not one, namely trade unionism on the one hand and abolition or anti-slavery on the other, and that each of these movements was dedicated to emancipating one kind of labor in capitalist society: trade unionism, free white labor, especially nascent industrial labor, and anti-slavery, of course, unfree black labor. Du Bois's point was that the two forms of labor are deeply imbricated together in capitalism. It requires both, and it requires them, in a sense, working in tandem. You don't get Manchester without Mississippi supplying the cheap cotton. And therefore, the fates of the two groups of workers are inextricably linked. Neither can emancipate itself without the other. They have to join forces. Here were two labor movements which could have, or at least should have, joined forces, failed to recognize each other, and did not. And had they done so, the whole history of the country would have been different. Possibly the history of capitalism more generally would have been different. So I find this an absolutely stunning, extraordinary argument, and it's very persuasive to me. And of course, the color line, this division between free and unfree labor has not disappeared, and many forms of anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggle can be thought of, both past and present, as unrecognized, unacknowledged labor struggles, including, in some cases, by the participants themselves. However, as a feminist, I say to myself, yes, But why only two? Isn't there also a third form of essential labor in capitalist society, and therefore a third unrecognized labor movement? And I'm talking about social reproductive labor, and therefore I'm talking about feminism. And so the idea then is, can we view feminism as a third labor movement, which unrecognized, even unself-recognized, as we were talking about with respect to Me Too just now? Can't we view this as the third pole, the third component of a potential sort of inclusive pro-labor front? And the idea is that that I think Du Bois had of what it meant for two labor movements to sort of join forces was not that they should merge because there was only one kind of labor. And by the same token, that's my idea in any case with respect to expanding it to three. By the way, I call this for short, in an informal way, Du Bois plus one. That's my name for what I'm doing. I'm really thinking again along Gramscian lines about an historic bloc, a counter-hegemonic bloc, in which these, and not only these, there will probably be other components too, but these might be the forms of labor that make it a pro-working class, a pro-labor bloc. And the idea, again, as in the previous work, is to try to show why their fates are imbricated, why none can liberate itself without the others, why, even though the situations and the experienced sufferings and harms and humiliations are different, they nevertheless are traceable to one and the same social system, which relies on all three forms of labor and relies on them working together in a kind of engine with three pistons, so to speak. And why, therefore, emancipation requires this form of cooperation. That's the idea in a nutshell.